Hi, welcome to Attainable Green. I'm Jess, and today we're talking about the Laelia or Cattleya purpurata. This is a care collab video with several other YouTubers to share how we grow this plant in our different environments and setups. Today, I'm going to be collaborating with Fernanda Nascimento, Karen's Orchids, Mary G Orchids, Matt by Nature, Ninja Orchids, Patricia Orchids, Plants and Other Things, and Tropical Plants Finland. We're all going to share how we take care of this plant, so hopefully this will be helpful to you. This is my Laelia purpurata. I've had it for about 2 years now, and I think it's just starting to gain its momentum and get established. I'm going to share a couple of mistakes I made when growing this plant, so hopefully you can avoid that. So I got this plant bare root from an orchid seller in the wintertime. So those two things are probably red flags for anyone who's been growing orchids for a long time. First of all, bare root orchids tend to be harder to establish unless you have it in the right growing season. Usually a bare root plant takes a longer time to establish itself, primarily because the root system is out of its media and it has an additional stress to being transported. Second of all, getting a plant in the wintertime is also a big no-no, especially one that's bare root. I think that just adds to the stress of the plant because that's not the season where the Cattleyas are growing, and so there's just a compounded stress onto this plant. So when I got it, it looked pretty healthy to me. It didn't have any media, so I thought, oh, this is going to be an easy repot. So I'm just going to pot it up, set it, and forget it. And it turns out that is the wrong thing to do, especially if you're new to growing Cattleyas. What ended up happening is that because I potted up this plant in the wintertime, it wasn't really growing, and I was watering it as if it was an established plant. So needless to say, whatever root system was in the pot did not do well. It got chewed up by snails and it just basically got decimated. So once the spring season arrived, I was excited because I thought this is the moment where the plant is going to establish itself and I'm gonna get great growth. It turns out it didn't have the best new growth. In fact, it just looked a little wonky and it still had some trouble. As the season progressed, I noticed that the older leaves started to take on this kind of pitting, some chlorosis, where the leaves just started to look really patchy and it just did not look good. So when I saw that this plant started to look like it was declining, the first thing that came to mind was it must be a virus. And the second thing that came to mind is it could be Fusarium. And of course, I started to freak out and wonder, how am I going to take care of this plant? Because it's clearly a problem plant. I decided to hold back and wait. I wanted to see how this plant would react with the new growing season before I decided to tear it up, cut it up, get a virus testing kit, and all that jazz. I was waiting for the new growth last year to see how it would perform. If the plant still had problems and trouble, then that might not be a good plant. But if it turned out to be a healthy growth, then the previous problems that are manifested would be something else. So last year's growth turned out clean. So the leaves are nice and green, the bulb is nice and firm, there's not really a problem with it. It's not the biggest growth that it could have, but it actually looks pretty healthy. So even though all of the older pseudobulbs and the leaves and everything else just looks terrible, the newer growth gives me hope that this plant is actually okay. And moving on, I'm hoping that this year's growth will look even better. What is the crazy problem that is going on with this plant? Well, I think it's a couple of things. First off, I got this plant bare root, so it had to pull all the reserves from the older pseudobulbs. So all the older pseudobulbs were desiccated because all of the energy is being pushed towards that new growth. So that's why most of the pseudobulbs are out of energy. Cattleyas tend to dump the older roots. It's just part of that process. And because I didn't time it when the new growth was starting, it definitely struggled to gain its momentum and it didn't have enough stored reserves to support the entire plant this way. Second of all this discoloration and pitting and this unsightliness, I think it's actually cold damage because I got this plant in the wintertime and I treated it as if it was all my other established Cattleyas that could handle the cooler temperatures. And I didn't really think about where this plant came from. It was originally in a greenhouse that had a more protected space, and I'm moving it to an outdoor exposed setup. So because this plant had to deal with a lot of stresses, that cold damage set in and it caused that chlorosis and the pitting into the leaf structure. So I think that's what's causing that horrible look of the leaves on this plant, and it's not actually a virus or fusarium. I actually cut one of the smaller seedling back bulbs of this plant to check the rhizome, and there was no purple ring or anything that would cause concern for me about this plant. So one, I was just able to wait it out to see how the new growth would perform before deciding that this plant had some crazy problem with it. In fact, if I probably put it in a more protected area, it probably wouldn't get all of this cold damage on the leaves, and the leaves would probably look a lot better. That is kind of a long story about how I was taking care of this plant and probably the things that you want to avoid. So if you want to have a healthy plant, please do not get it in the middle of winter and bare root it and then pot it up as if you were to pot up and treat the plant as if it was established. So just bear in mind that you just need to baby it a little bit if you're coming from a colder area, and give it time to adjust to your environment before pushing it out into the elements. Onto its care. I have this plant on my second story patio that gets kind of southern southwest light, and it gets light for about 8 to 10 hours during the growing season, and the rest of the time it's in kind of dappled shade. This is a very high light environment. It's probably the place where I can give the most light to my plants. In some cases, it could be too much and it can get sunburned. So as you can see, it has a bit of a sunburn spot as well from when I didn't try to gradually introduce the sunlight to the plant, it got sunburned. This plant can handle temperatures down to the 40s up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the growing season. And once again, if it's cool, then I try to keep it drier in winter. And then when it's warmer and hotter, then I try to give it more moisture and keep it well hydrated so that it doesn't stress the plant out. As for humidity, I would say the average hovers between 40 to 60% most of the time. There are a couple of days where I have really low humidity, but I try to counteract that by keeping the plant well hydrated. When it comes to water, I just use my normal tap water to water this plant, and it seems to be fine. And I water it very heavily during the growing season, and I back off during the winter time. So as it gets cooler, I use less water. When it gets warmer, I use more water, just to play it by ear. Currently, this plant is considered in recovery, so I'm not using any fertilizer on this plant until I feel like it's established, recovered, and healthy, because right now it just needs to focus on growing roots and having a new growth before trying to improve upon that. So that's why I don't give any fertilizer to this particular plant. I'm definitely hoping that the new growth will establish itself and put in a new root system, because the current root system is still trash. Even last year's growth has a decent root system, but it's not enough where I feel comfortable that this plant can survive and do well. I potted this plant up when I first got it, and I have not repotted it since. It seems to be doing okay in the media. The media hasn't broken down yet, and there's not a lot of roots in the pot, so I don't have to worry about that. The only thing is depending on where the new growth emerges, I may have to repot the year after. But currently, I think this pot is of a decent size, so I don't have to worry about it. So as for media, this is about medium-sized bark. It's nice and airy so that it gives a lot of space for the roots to grow. And it doesn't hold too much water. For this plant, since it doesn't have a lot of roots, I don't want the media to stay moist for too long, so I try to keep it as well draining as possible. If this year goes well and the new growth looks good, I may repot it up a size and give it more media, but for now, this just seems to work for me. As for problems with this plant, it's primarily the growth of this plant. I haven't dealt with any pests or disease issues on it, really. It's mostly just trying to get this plant to establish itself after being bare root. And basically, that was just my fault of not really knowing or understanding how to take care of this plant when I first got it. Because it was bare rooted, it took time for it to establish its root system, and that was just really the struggle. And during the first year, I just kept watering it a lot and watering it heavily. So snails definitely chewed up a bulk of the root system. So it doesn't really have much to go off of. Luckily last year, it was able to grow a nice, strong, healthy growth and have a decent root system. I'm going to give this plant 1 more year to establish its root system, and hopefully it will do well so that I don't have to worry about this plant anymore. As for blooms, I have no idea what it looks like. Supposedly this is the variety Carnea, which is supposed to have a pink lip, but the plant isn't healthy enough to flower, so I don't even know if I have the right plant. I'm just hoping for a healthy growing season this year. Please check out all the other YouTubers to see how they take care of the Lilja purpurata. Hopefully they all have healthier plants than mine, and that you can learn from what they did right as opposed to what I did wrong. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, Attainable Green, to follow along on my orchid journey. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!